The house was never supposed to feel this empty. David Miller stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the old brass key his father, George, had left him. The air smelled of dust and aged wood, but beneath it lingered something more profound: memories. He could almost hear his father's voice echoing in the silence. Sunday mornings spent laughing in the kitchen, his father's gruff yet warm voice always reminding him, "This house will always be home, son." But now, it was just David alone. His fingers tightened around the key, a lump rising in his throat. He had never expected to inherit this house, never imagined standing here without his father's presence to welcome him back. The grief clung to his chest like a weight. David took a deep breath, determined to step forward into the house, but the peaceful moment was shattered before he could even cross the threshold. "You have no right to be here." David spun around, his heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was a woman with a perfectly styled blonde bob and an expression that could curdle milk. She looked like she had just stepped out of a corporate meeting. Pearls, a crisp blazer, and an air of unshakable confidence. Her eyes narrowed, practically oozing disapproval. "Excuse me," David managed to say, his voice steadier than he felt. "I know exactly what you're doing," she said, stepping closer with the authority of someone who believed they ran the neighborhood. "You're squatting, trying to move into someone else's house. I've seen your type before." David stared at her, trying to process what was happening. His grip on the key tightened. "This is my house. I inherited it from my father." "Nice try," the woman scoffed. "The real owner isn't here, and I'm not about to let you waltz in and claim it. I know who lives here." David's patience started wearing thin. His father had mentioned a neighbor named Susan, always sticking her nose into everyone's business. He hadn't expected her to be this bad. "I am the real owner," David said slowly. "My father left me the house in his will." Susan's expression twisted into a condescending smirk. "People will say anything to get free real estate." To David's disbelief, she pulled out her phone. His stomach sank as she dialed a number. "Hello? Yes. I'd like to report a trespasser," she said, glaring at David. "There's a man breaking into my neighbor's home. He refuses to leave." David's pulse roared in his ears. Was this seriously happening? Anger bubbled up in his chest. He wasn't some criminal trying to sneak into a stranger's house. He was standing in his own home. He stepped forward, forcing himself to stay calm. "Susan, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she snapped, cutting him off with a dramatic wave of her finger. "I knew this would happen the moment George passed away. People like you, waiting for an opportunity to take advantage. I won't let you." David exhaled, struggling to keep his composure. "Check the county records," he said through gritted teeth. "My name is on the deed." "Oh, I will," Susan sneered. "But until then, the police will handle it." David clenched his fists, debating his next move. He could walk away and wait for the cops to show up. He had the will, the deed, and every piece of proof he needed. But the fact that he even had to prove his innocence was infuriating. Minutes later, sirens blared down the street, filling the quiet neighborhood with flashing red and blue lights. David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. His first night in his father's house, and he was already being treated like a criminal. As the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, David muttered under his breath, "Welcome home, I guess." The sheriff climbed out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. David recognized him, Sheriff Ben Carter, a familiar figure from his childhood. He'd been younger back then, with less gray in his beard, but his stern expression hadn't changed. "What seems to be the problem here?" the sheriff asked, glancing between David and Susan. Susan wasted no time. "Thank God you're here, Sheriff. I caught this man trying to break into George Miller's home. He refused to leave, and I feared for my safety." David's jaw tightened. Feared for her safety? She had practically bulldozed her way onto his property, and now she was playing the victim. Sheriff Carter raised an eyebrow. "George Miller's house?" "Yes," Susan nodded emphatically. "And I happen to know George didn't have any family living here. This man is obviously lying." David took a deep breath, stepping forward and keeping his hands where the sheriff could see them. "Sheriff, my name is David Miller. George was my father." He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. "I just drove in from Portland to settle things. I have the will, the deed, everything. I own this house." The sheriff studied David's ID, then looked him up and down as if trying to connect the man in front of him with the memory of a kid he hadn't seen in years. Slowly, recognition dawned on his face. "George's boy," he said, his tone softening. David nodded. "Yeah, I know it's been a long time since I've been back, but I have every right to be here." Susan crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, come on, Sheriff. He could have faked all of that. How do you know it's not some elaborate scam? Sheriff Carter gave her a long, tired look. Because I knew George, Susan. And I remember when he used to bring David into town as a kid. He handed David's ID back, then turned towards Susan. Unless you've got some actual legal reason to dispute this, I suggest you head on home. Susan's face turned a furious shade of red, but she wasn't ready to back down. I knew George. I checked on him when no one else did. This isn't right. David folded his arms. Maybe you checked on him, but that doesn't change the fact that he left his house to me. If he wanted you to have it, he would have put your name on the will. Susan pressed her lips into a thin line. This isn't over. Sheriff Carter sighed. It is over. And if you cause trouble again, we'll have another conversation, one you won't like. Susan shot David a glare sharp enough to cut steel, then spun on her heel and stormed off. As her car disappeared into the night, David knew this wasn't the last he'd see of her. The sheriff looked back at David. You planning on staying here long? David hesitated, looking back at the house. He still wasn't sure. This place held a lifetime of memories, some good, some painful, but it was his father's legacy, the last piece of him that remained. For now, David said finally, at least until I figure things out. Sheriff Carter nodded. Well, welcome back to town. And if Susan gives you any more grief, give me a call. David let out a short, dry laugh. I have a feeling I might have to. As the sheriff drove off, David stood alone on the porch, looking out at the darkened field stretching beyond the house. The land was silent, but his mind was anything but. Susan wasn't going to stop. That much was clear. And something told him this fight was just beginning. David woke up the next morning to an eerie silence. For a split second, he thought he was still dreaming. Flashes of his father's voice, the warm smell of pancakes in the kitchen, and the sound of his younger self playing in the backyard. But that peaceful illusion shattered the moment he heard a loud thunk from outside. He bolted upright, his pulse spiking. What was that? Another thunk echoed from the front porch. Heart racing, David grabbed a hoodie and headed to the door, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. What he saw made his stomach twist. The front porch was covered in garbage, bags of it torn open and spilling rotten food, crumpled papers, and broken glass all over the steps. The stench hit him immediately, a sour, rancid smell that made his eyes water. Right in the middle of the mess was a neatly folded piece of paper with a scrawled note. This town doesn't belong to strangers. Leave. David clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He didn't need to guess who was behind this. Susan had made her intentions crystal clear. This wasn't just some petty neighborhood spat. It was war. Taking a slow breath, David forced himself to think rationally. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to snap and storm into town yelling at her, so she could play the innocent victim in front of her friends. Not happening. Instead, David grabbed a pair of gloves from the hallway closet and spent the next half hour cleaning up the mess. The anger simmering beneath his skin didn't fade, but at least he had something to focus on. By the time he finished, a plan was already forming in his head. Susan wanted to make this personal? Fine. She was about to find out David Miller didn't scare easily. Later that day, David parked outside the county records office. If Susan thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she clearly didn't know who she was dealing with. The office smelled like old paper and stale coffee. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as David walked in. Can I help you? David nodded. Yeah, I need to pull up some property records. Specifically, I want to see if there are any claims or liens on the Miller estate. The clerk frowned. Your name? David Miller. George Miller was my father. Her expression softened. Ah, George was a good man. Sorry for your loss. David offered a tight smile. Thanks. Just trying to make sure everything's in order. I encountered someone who seems to think they have a right to the place. The woman sighed, shaking her head. Let me guess. Susan. David blinked. That obvious? She scoffed. Honey, Susan's been sticking her nose into other people's business since high school. She thinks she runs this town. Always has. Wouldn't surprise me if she's trying to pull something shady. She motioned toward a side desk. Take a seat. I'm Linda. I'll get those records for you. As David waited, his mind raced. What if there was something Susan was trying to exploit? What if his father had overlooked a detail in the paperwork? But when Linda returned with a thick folder, her expression told him everything he needed to know. There's nothing, she said simply. No claims, no disputes. Your father left the house and land entirely to you. Relief flooded through David, but it was quickly replaced by something sharper, determination. Susan had no legal leg to stand on. She had nothing. And now it was time to make that perfectly clear. David didn't go home right away. Instead, He made one more stop, Sheriff Ben Carter's office. The older man looked up from his desk as David walked in, raising an eyebrow. That was fast. You already need my help again. David dropped the folder onto the desk with a satisfying thud. Not yet, but I'm giving you a heads up. Sheriff Carter flipped through the pages, scanning them quickly before looking back up. What am I looking at? Proof that Susan has zero legal claim to my house, David said. And I wanted it on record that she's already started harassing me. She dumped garbage on my porch this morning. The sheriff exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. Not surprising. She's been pulling stunts like this for years, just never with anyone who fought back. Well, she picked the wrong person, David said flatly. She wants to intimidate me? Fine. But if she escalates, I want a paper trail. Sheriff Carter nodded. Smart move. He tapped his pen against the folder, then met David's gaze. I'll talk to her. Can't promise she'll back down, but she'll know we're watching. David let out a slow breath. That was enough for now, because Susan wasn't going to stop, not until she was forced to. And David was more than ready for that fight. He didn't have to wait long. The next evening, as David sat on the porch drinking a beer, headlights flared across the front yard. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in the driveway, its tires crunching over the gravel. Susan stepped out, her expression smug, arms folded like she was about to deliver a final, crushing blow. But she wasn't alone. A man in a tailored suit followed her, adjusting his tie as he eyed David with the cold calculation of a lawyer preparing for battle. David exhaled slowly, setting his bottle down. Here we go, he muttered. The lawyer approached first, extending a hand. Mr. Miller? I'm Mark Stevens, representing Ms. Susan. My client believes she has a valid claim on this property due to her close relationship with your late father. David crossed his arms, smirking. Is that right? Susan lifted her chin, her voice dripping with false emotion. George and I were very close. We had plans, David. He promised me this house. David raised an eyebrow. And yet, when it came time to put things in writing, he left everything to me? Must have slipped his mind, huh? Susan's face turned red, but Mark stepped in smoothly. A verbal agreement, especially between intimate partners, can still be legally enforceable under certain circumstances. If George promised my client this property, we have grounds to contest the will. David let out a short laugh. Cute argument, but let's be real. You don't have a case. I pulled the property records yesterday. There's nothing backing her claim. Mark didn't blink, but David could see he didn't like hearing that. That doesn't mean a court wouldn't take her claim seriously, Mark said. David's smirk widened. Right? And a court wouldn't take it seriously when I countersue for harassment? Trust me, Sheriff Carter already knows all about Susan's little intimidation tactics. Susan's confidence faltered for a second, her mask of calm cracking. David saw it and pushed harder. Sure, go ahead. Take it to court. I'd love to explain how you called the cops on the actual owner, dumped trash on my porch, and tried to pressure me into giving up my inheritance. That's not a great look, is it? The lawyer's confident expression faltered for the first time. David noticed a slight twitch in Mark Stevens' jaw. The lawyer straightened his tie and glanced at Susan, who was glaring at David with all the fury of a dictator whose power had just been questioned. Mark cleared his throat. It seems we may need to reassess the legal standing before proceeding further. Susan's eyes widened. What? No. Do something. David leaned back against the railing, arms crossed, smirking. Yeah, Mark, do something. But the lawyer was already backing off. He adjusted his briefcase and nodded stiffly. We'll be in touch, Mr. Miller. With that, Mark turned on his heel and made a swift retreat to the SUV, leaving Susan to simmer in her frustration. For a second, David thought she might actually scream. Instead, she clenched her fists, shot him a glare sharp enough to slice steel, and stormed after Mark. As the SUV roared to life and sped down the driveway, David exhaled, letting go of the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but he had won this round. He should have known Susan wouldn't go quietly. The next day, David was in town picking up some supplies when he overheard a couple of locals whispering in the corner of the store. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw him, their eyes darting away awkwardly. David sighed. Susan must have already started her smear campaign. He grabbed his supplies and made a mental note to keep his head down for now. But it didn't take long for Susan's next move to come to light. This time, it was even more ridiculous than the last. It started with a knock on his door just before dusk. David opened it to find a middle-aged man in a neon yellow vest holding a clipboard. David Miller? The man asked, scanning his clipboard like he just discovered something incredibly serious. Yeah, that's me. Name's Pete. I'm from the city's code enforcement department. We've received multiple complaints about your property being in violation of local ordinances. I'm here to conduct an inspection. David blinked. Violations? I just moved in. Pete shrugged. Sorry, pal. Got to follow up on complaints. As David walked with Pete around the property, it became painfully clear how ridiculous the complaints were. Susan had reported everything from excessive weeds in the backyard, which were minimal, to potentially hazardous porch steps that were completely solid. Pete sighed after his inspection, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, it's obvious someone's got it out for you. I'll write up a report saying everything's in order, but I'd keep an eye out. Sounds like you've got a neighbor with too much time on her hands. David nodded. Yeah, I've noticed. After Pete left, David couldn't help but laugh. Susan was getting desperate, throwing every trick in the book at him, but he wasn't about to back down. The next morning, David woke up to find a flyer taped to his front door. It read, "Attention neighbors. Beware of David Miller, a suspicious new arrival with a shady past. Do we really want him here?" David rolled his eyes. It was amateur hour at best. He peeled the flyer off and crumpled it in his hand. If Susan thought she could rally the neighborhood against him, she was about to be sorely disappointed. That afternoon, David decided it was time to flip the script. He headed into town and stopped at the local cafe, where half the town seemed to be gathered. He walked up to the counter, ordered a coffee, and turned to address the crowd. "Hey everyone," he said, raising his voice just enough to get their attention. "I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's David Miller. My dad, George, lived here for decades. I recently inherited his house and moved back to take care of it." A few heads nodded in recognition. "I know some rumors have been going around, and I just want to set the record straight. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to honor my father's legacy and be a part of this community." The crowd murmured quietly. A couple of the older locals smiled, recognizing David's sincerity. From the back of the cafe, Linda, the clerk from the records office, raised her coffee cup. "Welcome back, David." The rest of the cafe followed suit, a few murmuring words of welcome. Susan's plan to turn the town against him had officially backfired. As David walked out of the cafe, he felt a surge of confidence. Susan might have played her hand, but he still had a few cards up his sleeve. By the time he got home, he was ready for whatever came next. Sure enough, there was Susan, standing at the edge of the property with her arms crossed. David approached her, keeping his tone calm but firm. "You're wasting your time, Susan. This house is mine. It's legally mine. You can call the city, the sheriff, or even the mayor if you want, but it won't change anything." Susan's face twitched, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes for the first time. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Let me give you some advice," David continued. "Move on. Focus on something else, literally anything else. Because I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, it looked like Susan might argue, but then, without a word, she turned on her heel and walked away. David watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. He knew she wasn't done yet, not completely, but for now, she was out of tricks. And David? He wasn't just ready for the next round. He was looking forward to it. The morning after Susan's silent retreat, the world seemed unusually calm. David sat on the front porch with a steaming cup of coffee, letting the morning sun warm his face. The land stretched out in front of him, quiet, peaceful, and finally starting to feel like home. He knew better than to trust the calm completely. Susan wasn't someone who gave up easily, but for now, she was retreating, regrouping, and David was ready for whatever she threw at him next. The thing was, David wasn't alone anymore. Word of Susan's antics had spread like wildfire, and not in the way she intended. After David's impromptu speech at the cafe, people had started approaching him, neighbors introducing themselves, offering to help with anything he needed, and sharing their own Susan horror stories. It turned out Susan had been a thorn in the community's side for years. She'd meddled in property disputes, staged neighborhood interventions over minor infractions, and made countless enemies along the way. David had unknowingly become the underdog the entire town was silently rooting for. It all came to a head at the town council meeting a week later. David hadn't planned on attending, but one of the locals had tipped him off that Susan was planning to make a formal complaint about him in front of the council. He couldn't resist. When he walked into the town hall, the place was already buzzing with people. Susan stood at the front, speaking in her usual overly dramatic tone, painting herself as the victim of a terrible injustice. And if we let this kind of behavior go unchecked, Susan declared, it will set a dangerous precedent for our community. David couldn't help but smile. He waited for the right moment before raising his hand. May I respond? The council members looked at each other, then nodded. David stepped forward, calm and confident. I just want to clarify a few things. First, I'm not some random stranger. I grew up here. My dad, George Miller, lived in that house for over 40 years. He left it to me, legally. I have the will, the deed, and the full support of the county records office. A murmur spread through the crowd. Second, David continued, I've been nothing but respectful since I returned. I followed every rule, cleaned up the property, and made every effort to integrate back into this community. Meanwhile, Susan has called the cops on me, dumped garbage on my porch, filed bogus code violations, and spread lies about me all over town. Susan's face turned a deep shade of red. That's not true. Oh, David raised an eyebrow. Should we ask Sheriff Carter? He's got a record of everything. Or maybe we should ask Pete from Code Enforcement. He had a lovely time inspecting my non-existent violations. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Look, David said, softening his tone. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to stay. This house is my family's legacy, and I'm going to honor it. All I ask is to be given the same respect I've shown everyone else. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, one of the council members nodded. Well said, Mr. Miller. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with Susan storming out, avoiding eye contact with anyone. David walked out of the town hall feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He wasn't just the new guy anymore. He was part of the community again. The next few weeks passed in relative peace. Susan kept her distance, though David occasionally caught her glaring at him from across the street. It didn't bother him anymore. If anything, it was almost amusing. He threw himself into fixing up the house, painting the front porch, repairing old furniture, and bringing life back to the garden his father had once loved. Neighbors would stop by to chat or drop off homemade pies, offering little bits of advice and encouragement. One afternoon, as David was planting new flowers along the front path, an older man named Walter stopped by. He leaned on the fence, watching David work with a thoughtful expression. You know, Walter said, I knew your dad pretty well. He was a good man, tough but fair. You're a lot like him. David smiled. Thanks. I'm just trying to do right by him. Walter nodded. You're doing a good job. And don't worry about Susan. She's all bark, no bite. She'll move on to someone else eventually. Always does. David chuckled. Let's hope so. By the time summer rolled around, the house had transformed. The porch gleamed with fresh paint, the garden bloomed with bright flowers, and the once empty rooms were filled with new furniture and old memories. One evening, David sat on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sunset. He thought about everything that had happened, his father's passing, the chaos with Susan, and the strange journey that had brought him back here. It wasn't how he'd imagined things would go, but in a way, it felt right. This house wasn't just a building. It was a part of him, a piece of his history that he was finally reclaiming. And Susan? Well, she was still out there, lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity. But David knew he could handle her. After all, he wasn't the same man who had stood on that porch weeks ago, unsure of his place in the world. He'd found his footing, found his strength, and no matter what came next, this was his home, and he wasn't going anywhere.